March 10th, 1126. The troops of Alfonso the Battler are surrounded by two Saracen armies. There is no escape. They came to the aid of the Mozarabs of Granada, and now they are trapped. There are only two options: fight and die with honor in an attempt to break the siege, or surrender and throw down the cross. But Alfonso never lost his faith. After the capture of Zaragoza and the overwhelming victory at Cutanda, Alfonso's fame was sky high. He was the warrior who had succeeded El Cid as the most powerful man in Christendom. And, of course, his victories echoed throughout the entire peninsula. And who decided to try their luck with Alfonso? El Batallador? The Mozarabs of Granada. It turns out that the Mozarabs were Christians who lived under Saracen rule, but of course, they lived in subjugation. To begin with, they had to pay extra taxes just for being Christians, apart, of course, from being a lower class in society. This got worse with every fundamentalist wave that arrived from Africa. After the arrival of the Umayyad Caliphate, Abderrahman came to establish the Umayyad Emirate after the revolt in Bassi. The Almoravids would also arrive, and then the Almohads, each overthrowing the previous government for its supposed tolerance toward Christians. This is the opposite of how Alfonso the Battler acted when he took Zaragoza, where he treated the Muslims as equals. Of course, one way will generate unrest and ultimately rebellions, while the other surely will not. It turns out that the Mozarabs of Granada requested help from the Aragonese monarch to take the city and liberate them. Look at the map. What they're asking is for the Aragonese troops to leave from the Ebro and reach the heart of the Almoravid Empire, and take such an important city. And to support their request, they promised the Battler that 12,000 men from Granada would join the Army of Salvation as soon as their banners appeared on the horizon. Of course, we're talking about if Alfonso arrived with his troops near Granada. Inside the walls, 12,000 men would rise up in arms. Victory guaranteed. And of course, the news would spread like wildfire throughout the Almoravid Empire. And would the Christian population imitate their actions? Achieving in one or two campaigns to depose Muslim power and, in its place, establish a Christian principality that, just like in Zaragoza, would tolerate Muslims to avoid an uprising. Identical to the principalities of Antioch and Tripoli, or the famous Kingdom of Jerusalem. It was a complicated plan, but Alfonso didn't say no to an adventure and accepted the proposal. Would he march south with his men? Do you remember what Alfonso II did when he sacked Lisbon without opposition? Well, this would be an even bolder campaign. Alfonso the Battler prepared the campaign thoroughly. He summoned troops from Navarre, Aragon, and his allies from the south of France, assembling an army of 5,000 knights and 15,000 infantrymen. An incredible army. But it was only natural. He needed to set out with at least a minimal guarantee of victory. He was joined, of course, by the French crusader Gaston de Beauharnais, whom we met at the capture of Zaragoza. On September 2nd, 1125, the Crusader army set out for war. I said Crusader, even though that campaign was not an official crusade decreed by the Pope. The thing is, for those men it was a crusade, because they were setting out to fight to defend the Christians who were under Islamic rule. The army set out for Valencia, since they had also received a request for help from the Mozarabic Christians of Valencia. As the Aragonese host approached the capital, groups of Mozarabic Christians joined their forces. The surrounding regions and some of the Mozarabic Christians of Valencia also left their homes and joined the Aragonese. The Almoravid governor, upon learning of this, hastily prepared the defense of the city, as he did not want Valencia to fall back into Christian hands, barely 20 years after having recovered it. However, the Battler passed by and continued marching wherever he went. Rivers of Christians joined him. The rumor of his campaign echoed strongly and was no longer perceived as a crusader army, but as a liberation army. Alzira Shativa Dania Orihuela. His Mozarabs marched with Alfonso. From there he reached Murcia, followed the coast and entered Almeria, now heading toward Granada. In the village of Granada, the army celebrated Christmas and prepared for the final assault, the climax of the campaign. At that time, according to the chronicles, the army had 50,000 men. Now, most likely, this figure is an exaggeration. And besides, many of the Mozarabs are not professional warriors, but rather conscripts. So they're not of very good quality either, and that will have to be taken into account in battle. On January 7, 1126, Alfonso the Battler saw the walls of Granada for the first time. However, he did not camp next to it, but about 14 kilometers away in Nibar. But of course, they had been campaigning for 4 months, and Yusuf had had time to prepare. All the Almoravid armies had gathered in the city to defend it. Even warriors from the African garrisons had arrived. Now we have a very large Christian army that must survive off the land, which, by the way, is also receiving supplies from the Mozarabs in the area. On the other hand, we have the Saracen army, well protected behind the walls of Granada and very well supplied. And I ask you, isn't someone missing? Where are the 12,000 men that the Mozarabs of Granada promised? Well, ladies and gentlemen, they backed out. They blamed the Aragonese monarch, claiming that he had taken too long and that the Muslims had been able to gather their forces. They no longer took up arms for fear of dying without achieving anything. Big problem. Alfonso was hundreds of kilometers away from his kingdom, or at least from a Christian kingdom like Leon. He had tens of thousands of mouths to feed, and with each passing day, the Muslims grew stronger. The plan had failed. Would this be the first failed campaign of the Battler? On January 23, 1126, Alfonso broke camp and set out with his men. Where to? To Granada? Back to Aragon? No. He marched toward the heart of Andalusia, passed through Macarena, Pinos, Alcalá, La Real, all the way to Écija, very close to Seville, and there he turned back, heading toward Cabra. What was he looking for with this incursion? It's not known. Maybe it was an attempt to devastate the area, so that the campaign wouldn't be a complete disaster. The fact is that General Abu Bakr was pursuing him at all times with a civilian army, stalking him, harassing his patrols, and finishing off the warriors who fell behind. Abu Bakr was Viriato, and the Aragonese were the Romans. By the way, if you want to know the story of Viriato, you can find it up here. The weeks went by and Tamin, governor of Granada, with his own troops, was trying to block the way of the Battler, so that he would be forced to fight and, predictably, to die. After 6 months of campaigning, the Saracens managed to surround Alfonso's army in Arnisol. Again, this battle is not well documented, so we are going to see a recreation of how it might have been. Based on what is known and filling in the numerous gaps, the map would look more or less like this. What the chronicles tell us is that Alfonso the Battler was surrounded by the Almoravid troops. And since separately the Aragonese could defeat first the army of Seville and then that of Granada, it's not likely that he was fleeing. The hypothesis we are going to start from is that Alfonso decided to set up his camp in this position, with one side covered by a steep hill, from which it would be impossible to receive an attack. They spent the night there with their proper guard posts to prevent an enemy attack. The night was calm, but at dawn, they saw that they were surrounded. The armies of Sevilla and Granada had positioned their troops around the Christian army during the night. Taking advantage of their knowledge of the terrain, they had taken out the Christian pickets, so that the Aragonese would be unaware of the threat looming over them. At sunrise on the 10th of March in the year 1126, Alfonso's heart sank. The alarm was quickly raised, and all the Crusaders armed themselves and prepared for battle. However, the Muslims had time on their side, and during the morning they were content to slowly tighten the siege. They finally had the most famous knight of Al-Andalus since El-Cid, the undefeated monarch who captured substantial territory from the Caliphate. At last he would pay for his offenses. As the Saracens approached, Alfonso divided the army into 4 large groups, and they withdrew toward the hill, avoiding being crushed by the enemy's superior numbers. The Muslims kept advancing and managed to reach the first tents of the Christian camp. However, no one looted them. They were so eager to defeat the battler that everyone wanted to take part in the fight. The hours went by, and at noon Alfonso made a decision. If he had to die, he would die fighting. He would die fighting for Pamplona and Aragon, for his men, for his legacy, and for his God. He took up his shield, drew his sword, and rallied his men. Would it be the last time he saw them alive? They would all ride together toward death. They would be buried in Muslim territory, but they would be remembered for all eternity. But deep in his thirst, he still believed in victory. He felt God was on his side, as his priests assured him. He ordered his knights to form up beside him and charged, followed by the infantry. They couldn't give the enemy time to act. The knights charged with lowered lances, galloping at full speed and crashing into the Saracen lines, who thought they had won. The Almoravids were swept away by the horsemen, with Alfonso leading them. The heavy Crusader cavalry managed to break the siege, breaking through the enemy line and coming out the other side. The impact on enemy morale had been tremendous. They didn't know what was happening. No one expected it. Then came the charge of the Aragonese infantry. Men covered in steel, accompanied by desperate Mozarabs, charged, crying out to the heavens for victory. Blood ran through the valley, and soon the typical stench of urine and sweat took over the air. The rest of the Muslim troops charged in to try to save their companions, but it was a timid charge. Honestly, no one wanted to find out if what they said about the battler was true. They saw from afar how the knights' swords rose and fell on their brothers, and they didn't want the same thing to happen to them. When the attacked part of the siege was destroyed, Alfonso pivoted his army to charge against the Almoravids first. However, they didn't want to fight. Tamino ordered a retreat to their own camp to offer resistance, but his men ignored him. The Almoravid army became a leaderless mob. Anarchy prevailed. Some advanced, others stayed to fight, while others slowly retreated. Alfonso took advantage and charged against them, and it didn't take long to break them and make them flee. The Aragonese monarch was content with having broken the front. He didn't want to pursue the enemy, fearing it might be an ambush. He ordered a return to the camp, doubled the guards, and spent the night. When the sun rose, there was no one left. Before the Crusader army, Alfonso the battler tasted victory once again. He decided to return to Granada. Let's see if now that he had defeated the enemy, the Mozarabs of the city would rise up in arms. But when he arrived, he found a new army that had come from Morocco. He made the decision. The campaign was over. He marched east until he reached Murcia, and from there he continued north, pursued at all times by the new Muslim army. The Aragonese finally, in June of that year, after 9 months of campaigning, returned to their kingdom tired and sick, without having achieved the goal of taking Granada. But of course he had brought with him thousands and thousands of Mozarabs, and what did he do with them? He settled them around Zaragoza to ensure the loyalty of the territory. And when he arrived, they also gave him some news. Queen Urraca of Leon, his ex-wife. She had died 2 days before the Battle of Arnisol. Alfonso the battler, despite not having been defeated in battle, had failed in the capture of Granada. But the worst was yet to come. Soon we will see the battler on multiple fronts, but we will see that in the next episode.